Welcome to the Golden Mean, everybody. The right, conservative talk radio is a fascinating subject, and it's given the Republican Party a ton of power over the years, but it's also diluted that power in ways that a lot of people, I think, don't understand. So I am so thrilled to have on this program today a guest and a colleague of mine. His name is Brian Rosenwald. I'm going to give him the full wind-up here. He wrote a book just recently out. It's really popular, called Talk Radio's America, how an industry took over a political party that took over the United States. Brian is the editor of the Made by History section at the Washington Post. He's a PhD and an instructor at the University of Pennsylvania. And in his bio, this is why he and I are simpatico. This guy's like my professional soulmate. I'm going to read this. He loves the intersection of history, political science, media, and communication, which is basically my whole life outside, if you took movies out. So Brian, thank you for doing this, for coming on to talk about the book and everything else. I've been excited to do this, and we're simpatico on so much of this stuff. Thank you for doing this. Welcome.
My pleasure. It's happy to be with you.
So let's start here. I think that I remember back in 1988 when Rush Limbaugh was just about to go national. I was a kid, and I saw, the only reason I know this is because he was on the Oprah Winfrey Show. She actually was ahead of this. She had on her national show, she saw that you're about to be the syndicated voice, and you're very controversial, blah, blah, blah. And people didn't know what the hell, who he was. But I remember that 30 years later, because of who Rush Limbaugh became and because nobody had any idea and saw him coming. Talk about your premise for the book and the misunderstanding people have about how talk radio on the right really came into be this force.
Well, I think what people get wrong so often is that they see the rise of talk radio as, oh, it must have been some sort of political machination, that there was some meeting, Richard Nixon hated the mainstream media, and somebody said, well, let's sit down and build a right-wing kind of bypass. And yes, it's true that, Roger Ailes had the idea of a conservative network in the early 70s, and Nixon and Spiro Agnew did rail about the media. Those things are all true. But the modern conservative media happens really by accident. And the accident is the talent of Rush Limbaugh, basically. AM radio is desperate for new content in the 80s. AM radio has been struggling now for, a couple of decades, because as soon as FM gets in the cars, people realize that music sounds better on FM. If you for those who are younger in the audience who are like, well, what's this guy talking about? Because you've never listened to music on AM radio, I urge you, go out and take a listen, even to a ball game on AM or FM. Once we get sports back, please soon. You try to even listen to a ball game on AM and FM, and you'd be shocked at how much clearer it sounds on FM. And with music, the advertising revenue and the audience. And so that left AM needing unique content. And a lot of radio programmers going back to the early 80s say, we're not sure this talk thing could work. And at the time, talk sounded a lot more like Larry King, for those who remember the CNN show, or his old overnight mutual broadcasting system show, where he could talk to a president or a congressman, but they could be talking about abominable snowmen 5 minutes later because it was 3 a.m. and that was who was calling. People.
By the way, that's where the whole Philadelphia. I know you're in Philly. Philadelphia, hello. That comes from the radio long before CNN.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And so they try talk. They say, you know what, music is going to fail, so we might as well take our shot with this other thing. And they start to see really big ratings growth for anything that is talk. And then Rush Limbaugh comes along. This is a guy who, if I had gotten you in 1984, and I would have only been one, so I would have had to be a very smart baby.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, man.
Get this right. But in 1984, if somebody says to you, this Limbaugh guy is going to be the next political powerhouse, you would have laughed in their faces. We're talking about a guy who at the time had just gone to Sacramento to start doing a radio show there, who had been fired 5 times as a DJ in the 70s because he wasn't very good at listening to his bosses, which this is my bit of advice for everybody out there. If you don't listen to your boss, it doesn't go well in employment terms. And Limbaugh learns that. And then he does group sales and marketing for the Kansas City Royals. And he is so miserable by the end of his time with the team that he's hoping they're going to lose and get knocked out of the playoffs because he wants the season to be over. And he goes back to radio. He gets fired again in Kansas City because he ripped the Chiefs management while his station was trying to get the Chiefs broadcasting contract. Again, not a great strategy for employment. And he gets lucky. A guy who's programming on station, the station in Kansas City, who had seen his talent, his partner's programming KFBK in Sacramento. And they have to fire Morton Downey because he says something racist. And their owner says to the station manager, well, you've got two choices. Either he can go or you both can go. It's really up to you. So Downey gets fired and they bring Limbaugh in and he takes off. He becomes the local star in Sacramento, doing a show that is a lot more fun and playful than what he does today, but is basically a lot of the same shtick, excursion and broadcasting excellence and all of that kind of stuff. And he's fun, he's brash, he's controversial, he's in your face, he's things that people have never heard before. And I won't get into a lot of the nitty gritty of how he gets discovered and ends up national, but August 1st of 88, he launches this national show. And this is a moment when the rules in talk radio, in so much as talk radio even exists at this point, and there's only a couple hundred talk stations in America, are that it's got to be local to succeed. The people want to talk about what's going on in City Hall, what their governor did, the stoplight that's not working on Elm Street. They want to talk about those things that affect their lives, the blizzard coming, you name it. And that the only time slot that nationally syndicated radio works is Larry King's overnight slot. In the overnight hours, it's zanier, this kind of thing can work. And the idea is that the show has to be built around callers and interviews. And Limbaugh throws it all in his head. He's nationally syndicated. He takes far fewer callers than anybody else. He does, far fewer interviews, almost no interviews. The first interview is not until 1992 when he's got Vice President Quayle and President Bush on. And it's all about his ideas, what he's thinking, what he feels like talking about in the moment. And he's doing parodies and skits and the old, I'm going to date myself here, but the old ABC, NBC, CBS, they used to run miniseries. You'd have the first part on Sunday, the second part on Tuesday, the third part on Thursday. And he did like this whole teaser for one called Gulf War I, where he cast the whole thing. And you hear the announcer voice announcing the cast. And it's funny. You say, oh, Betty White is Barbara Bush. You're kind of chortling, laughing. This stuff's funny. But he's also got a conservative message embedded in all of this. He's talking about the politics that he grew up with around his dinner table. And people flock to the show. They love it. And they're saying, Rush, thank God you're on the air. We finally have a voice. And this is what has the light bulb go off for radio executives.
But by the way, and for the record, to be clear, I totally disagree with Rush Limbaugh's politics and some of the things he says. A lot of them I abhor. So if I'm smiling, it's not because I'm a Rush Limbaugh fan, but we're talking about how this came to be and a business and an industry and its political implications. And I remember even in the 90s, so people don't even know this. I'd say hardly any, you'll know it, that Mike Pence, he lost twice for Congress, and he was a radio guy, just a very boring, the opposite of Rush, very boring radio guy in Indiana before he finally got elected to Congress. And 15 years later, he's vice president. But Rush Limbaugh he has a unique talent. That's the thing. People who don't like him, don't like Donald Trump, like me. A lot of people can't acknowledge their talent. I mean, Rush Limbaugh could just talk for hours. He didn't even need the callers. And when he said in that booming voice, "Talent on loan from God," he believed it, right? That's my Rush Limbaugh impression. So now take me to the next step where the Republicans realized, look, the liberals tried to do Air America, right, 15 years ago. And Rachel Maddow, I think, was on that long before she ever became an analyst and then became a national sensation. And Air America didn't really work. I think Al Franken, a bunch of people, didn't work the same way. Talk about how the Republicans harnessed this popularity with Rush and other hosts, and it did become a political force, even if it wasn't designed that way.
Well, you get a chain of dominoes, Michael, that goes off where people in the radio business, they like to tell you, hey, we're not the most creative lot of people. We're lemmings. Because the first question their boss is going to ask them when they program something is, where's this working? Because if you try something new and it fails, you're next on the line. If you do something that somebody else is doing and it fails, well, you were just trying what made sense at that point. And so they start going towards more and more conservative shows. And then the first couple of all conservative stations succeed in liberal markets, Seattle and San Francisco. And then it becomes kind of idiom in the business right at the moment that the business is going to consolidate because of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and other things. It becomes the idiom that the format that works is all conservative talk. And so you get these stations that are all conservative. And right about the same moment, especially 1993, 1994, right in there, you get the Republican Revolution, the Newt Gingrich-led revolution that catapults Republicans back into power in the House for the first time since 1955. And Limbaugh and his ilk have spent the campaign. Most hosts are local at this point, and they've emceed rallies, and they've hosted Republican challengers, and they've run down Democratic incumbents, and they've encouraged people to vote. And it becomes an outlet for the newly elected Congress people to work around the mainstream media, which they think is hopelessly biased, and have a pleasant conversation so that when they do something that a host doesn't like, he can still say, you know, Congressman Jones is a good guy. Good guy. He got this one wrong, but he's a good guy. And they can go on and have a conversation and tell people what they're doing. And they're talking to the host who they might have seen at the barbecue, you know, Saturday night. They have these relationships because these are communities. And so Republicans get it. They get that this is where their base is gravitating rapidly. And they get that there's a political benefit to them to being heard and that they can get their message out. And they start building outreach operations that are pumping out talking points and segment ideas and one-page memos on issues and potential guests. They invite hosts to the Capitol to broadcast, you know, and get a steady stream of congressmen on. Republicans move to capitalize on this. And Democrats are actually not that far behind. In fact, Bill Clinton is ahead of anybody else in getting this. And it's only over time that the Democrats kind of sour. They say, you know, we can't even get a fair shake. And I'm not even sure that that judgment was right, in that, yes, there are better places for Democrats to go to find their base.
Right.
But every Democrat I talked to who was a talk radio regular said, you know, I get treated better by these guys. They don't demonize me in the same way. They'll say, you know, I think he's wrong about everything, but at least he has the guts to come on and talk to me every week. And, you know, there's a concern, I think, among Democrats that you're going to go on and get screamed at. And there are some hosts that you have to be aware of, and there are some hosts that look, Republican communications people aren't going to put their boss on because they don't want to have to sit there during an interview and say, you know, is it too early to reach for the bottle on my desk at 10 o'clock in the morning because I'm about to get fired when my boss gets off this call. But for most Democrats, they found that hosts, whether we're talking Sean Hannity, you know, that they would, as long as you'd spar with them, they do it politely and they wouldn't demonize you. And especially for Democrats in red states or districts, it was a way to reach their constituents.
Right.
It was a way to say, hey, I'm not so bad.
And by the way, in the book I wrote, Unlock Congress, it talks about how few competitive districts are left because of what I call rigged House races, especially. But this is exactly right. These are niche audiences. That's why this was, if you thought about this, it was going to be a success from the get-go because the right didn't really have that. And so maybe it's a smaller audience by some measure, but in these local communities, I don't care if it's Seattle, whatever, you're going to have a niche that's dedicated and loyal. Now, you and I first met a couple of years ago, ironically, because I submitted an idea to you at the Washington Post, and you guys took me up on it, and then I wrote an op-ed, and you helped edit it, and it was about how Nixon's staff in the late 60s, early 70s had this 15-page memo about wanting to have their own local news network television-wise, and then Ailes got a hold of it, and he wrote all these notes in the margin, and then, you know, 25 years later it happened, and my point was that it's also protected Trump, that if Nixon had that, he might not have resigned office. So tell me, are those just two totally different tracks, Brian, the TV and the radio? Where did they intersect along the way?
Well, the intersection is Limbaugh. Again, you know, 1992, he starts a television show that would run late night in a lot of markets, or early in the morning, 3-4 o'clock in the morning. It was a multimedia syndicated television show. And most people admit, I think, including him, that he was better on the radio. That was his first love, going back to his childhood. That he really loved radio, and that his TV show was nothing special. It was the same shtick as radio, except he only had 24 minutes, and they had images, and people would send them videos and stuff. And he does 4 years of this. The significant reason, the reason I bring it up, is the executive producer of that television show and Limbaugh's friend, and the guy who actually took him to the White House the first time, was Roger Ailes.
Yeah.
So my suspicion, and the only person who knows this for sure, is Roger Ailes, and he obviously has taken his secrets beyond the place I can reach, is that Ailes sees the success of Limbaugh, that he sees what's going on, and that he says, this is a moment that's auspicious for relaunching that idea I had in the 70s, very conservative, leaning TV network, and builds it on the model of Limbaugh, which is to say that it is combative, it is full of opinion, it is entertainment first. It's infotainment, what I call infotainment, which is that you can get information from it, but it's focused primarily on holding an audience. What do we have to do to hold the audience, to keep them engaged? When they have panel shows, my favorite example is The Five, where it's 4 conservatives and a liberal. It's designed for the liberal to lose. Why? So a conservative viewer can see their values being upheld, can see their side winning.
Sorry to interrupt. It's 4 against 1. It's one.
Right.
There's, it's exactly. Actually, it's almost comic because it's so transparent about it. Like, we're going to have 4 opinions, and Juan or whoever the liberal is of the day is like back on their heels and sort of juggling, fighting back.
What was their first, counterpoint show? It's Hannity and Combs. Well, it starts as Hannity and liberal to be named later. And look, I interviewed the late, great Alan Combs. He's a nice man. He was a talented radio broadcaster. He was a good stand-up comic, apparently, at one point. But he's a mellow guy. And Hannity's a pugilist. And the idea was that Alan was going to take it on the chin every night.
Yeah.
And, this is what Ailes builds. And one thing that I uncovered that I never expected to find was an ad that Limbaugh reads directly in 1997, telling people to check out this new thing, Fox News, which had launched in, I think, October of 96. So this is real early on. This is like 6 months in. And he's telling people, you got to check this out. Call your cable and satellite provider. Ask them to give you this Fox News. It's not just the host's opinions, which is ironic. It's not just, this kind of, he's hinting at bias. And then the tagline is, Fox News is fair news. Yeah. And so that tells you that Fox knows that Limbaugh's audience is their audience. That's who they want to capture. And so I think there's a lot of Limbaugh that's really illustrative for everybody in the media business, that says there is this audience of conservatives out there that none of you ever identified, that is desperate for content that reflects their values.
By the way, you just reminded me of something. It's a pet peeve. When I listen to a lot of Sirius radio, and once in a while there's a ad on for Rachel Maddow's show, and at the end you hear her say, "Get the news every night without fear or favor." And my face goes white when I hear that. And I'm not talking about her brilliance as a broadcaster, but to say that show is without favor, I think it's certainly a lot more fact-based than shows that I watch on the right. It's just my own opinion. But to say it's without favor, there's some of this on the left too. So let me. I want to read the subhead of your book again and ask you a question. Okay. So again, Brian's book is Talk Radio's America: How an Industry Took Over a Political Party that Took Over the United States. And so this flipped at a certain point, and I want to read from your writing. You wrote, quote, Limbaugh once declared, "There's no such thing as a moderate. A moderate is just a liberal disguise, and they are doing everything they can to derail the conservative agenda." I want to quote you once more and then let you take it from there. Brian writes, "Having a party that stood for something and was willing to fight for it was far more important than a few seats here or there. Turning politics into a blood sport and kicking moderates off the team made for good, passionate radio and meshed with listeners' frustrations. Crucially, because hosts had no responsibility to govern, they didn't have to worry about the policy or electoral consequences of such a stance." So talk about that, how all of a sudden this thing kind of went further off the rails than a lot of moderate and establishment Republicans who had found it a benefit. Isn't that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, what makes these hosts so interesting in the political process is that they are the only powerful force here in politics where their number one goal every day is not politics. They don't wake up saying, at the NRSC, the Republican Senate Committee, they wake up every morning saying, how are we going to protect our incumbents and elect new Republicans? In the White House, they wake up every morning and say, how can we boost President Trump's approval ratings?
Right.
Through policy, through politics, whatever we're doing. What's good for us politically? Hosts say, what do we have to do the best show today? What does our audience care about? What are people talking about around water coolers? That's what they're going to engage, and they have their finger on the pulse of the audience, and they don't want to lose the bond that they've cemented with that audience, the friendship that they've built with people who might be listening to them 15 hours a week. And to do that, it doesn't necessarily mean that what they're doing is good for the Republican, electoral prospects or the Republican policy agenda at any given moment. They want to reflect where their audience is. They want to be authentic. They want to do things in the most entertaining way, which does not mean sitting there and explaining why they just sold the farm in a compromise or something like that. Because spoiler, that's not very good radio. Nuance doesn't sound good. It takes 10 minutes.
Yelling. Sorry to interrupt. Yelling sounds good, or appealing to people's passions, especially if they're going to listen to politics. Right? People have an opinion. It's part of that self-affirmation bias that we talk about on the MSNBC and Fox News. Isn't that some of it? They are communicating to an audience. That's who they care about. Their audience.
Right. The best radio is emotional. Radio is what we call a hot medium, unlike television. The job of a host, what a host wants to do is reach out through that radio set and have you sitting in your car in the driveway because you don't want to miss what they're saying. It's emotional in some way, whether it makes you angry, whether it makes you sad, whether it makes you happy and feel like, hey, somebody's fighting for me. That's what they're trying to do. And to do that is often at odds with what Republicans need. If they need to raise the debt ceiling, for example, which nobody actually likes doing, but is a must, Republicans don't want to sit there and have to explain how all the leading economists said you have to do, all this kind of stuff. That's bad radio. Your average host doesn't want to do that. And Republicans may need to do that because they're governing. And that's the way it goes. And so you see these gulfs where hosts are pushing for people who stick to their principles. They say, if these guys would just fight for you, they might get something done. They might actually achieve those promises they made to us. And you get the heroes by the 2010s. And we're flashing forward a little bit, but the heroes on this medium by the 2010s are people like Mark Meadows, the new White House chief of staff, or Jim Jordan, or Ted Cruz, or Tom Massey, the guy who made everybody come back to Washington to vote on the coronavirus bill. And now we find out that one of the Democratic congresswomen who came back, in fact, is infected, and put all his colleagues at risk. It's those guys, the guys who 40 years ago or 50 years ago would have been consigned to like the Merchant Marine Committee, which was like congressional Siberia. They take some guy from Arizona and put him on the Merchant Marine Committee where he had absolutely no interest because they were punishing him. Yeah. This is what those guys can now become heroes. Those guys can go on these shows and they say, God, we wish we had a Congress full of Meadowses, and the rhinos, the Republicans in name only, who when this starts are moderates, true moderates. People who today would probably be Democrats, as they fade away, it starts to be the Republican leaders. Oh, that Boehner sold us out again. Or that Paul Ryan, I can't stand that guy. Those kinds of people get perceived as sellouts. And what happens is the Republicans move further right, and not just further to the right, but further towards like combat politics, further towards a place where the paradigm becomes Donald Trump.
Yeah, no. Oh, so well said. All right, I'm gonna last question, and this one I'm gonna broaden it out, and I'm gonna wind you up for it. Okay, so not just radio but television. I'm talking about the last 30 years, but especially the last 15 years or so of the cable networks and their soaring popularity. And this is a little bit of a chicken egg question, but I'd love to get your take because you study all this. This is your wheelhouse. there's so much, there is so much division in this country right now. There's just no question about it. You know, there's different types, but our civil discourse is not what it was. Even when we thought this was crazy partisan, you know, back in '94 with when Gingrich took over and Clinton was president, these guys talked offline. They were getting stuff done. Part of it was an act. Today, with social media, not just cable, social media too, but a lot of it's fed by the cable networks, right? How much does the proliferation of all of that media have to do with this division in this country and the way people talk to each other or don't talk to each other anymore, the way that campaigns attack each other? And by the way, or is it not that much worse than, you know, we just didn't live in the era of the Civil War and we just look at it differently because of modern technology? That's a big, broad question, but I know you can handle it.
Well, first of all, I don't know that politics is any dirtier, uglier than it was in the 19th century, you know, when they were saying, Mama, where's my pa? And the Republicans were, or I'm sorry, the Democrats were responding, gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha.
Yeah.
You know, politics are ugly. And they've always been ugly. You've always had nasty campaigns. But where this stuff matters is as part of a bigger picture, which is that we're becoming more and more insulated as a country and insular. We are living in echo chambers. Your average conservative, if you go down their blocks right now, my guess is, first of all, that they have Donald Trump signs on like every lawn, or most lawns, and your neighbors agree with you. We're seeing far fewer split ticket voters, far fewer crossovers,
Right.
where a senator can win in a state that their presidential candidate didn't win. Far fewer, you're getting red states, blue states, red districts, blue districts. And some of that is gerrymandering in the House. Some of that is that people are geographically sorting. Liberals are living in urban areas and suburbs. Conservatives are living in exurbs and rural areas. And you're getting this kind of geographic polarization, and the media then exacerbates that. Your average conservative probably wakes up in the morning, flips on Fox and Friends. They might get in the car to go to work, and they're listening to the local AM conservative radio station, which has usually a local host in morning drive because it's the most lucrative part of the day for a station. Yeah. They might get to the office, and if they get a lunch break, they might tune in a Rush. On the way home, it's Hannity, or in a bigger market, a local conservative host. Then they're going to flip on Fox at night. If they're checking news during the day, it's Breitbart, it's Red State, it's Town Hall, it's Daily Caller, it's websites like that. Whereas your average liberal, you know, is waking up, they're putting Morning Edition on. They might watch Morning Joe when they're at home. They listen to NPR in the car. They're checking the New York Times, the Washington Post. They might flip on Huffington Post or Daily Kos or some sort of left-leaning site. They come home at night. They got MSNBC on. They want to see Maddow and Chris Hayes and those kinds of things. And that's for the mainstream liberal. They're listening to Pod Save America, things like that. And these are, you know, totally different worlds. If you've ever been in a gym or a place like that, and you have one television with MSNBC, one television with CNN, one television with Fox, and you watch, you know, the ACE story block, the first 10, 15 minutes of the hour, what you're going to find is that they're not even on the same planets. You're like, was this the same Tuesday?
Yeah.
You know, what's going on here?
The rundowns, alternate universes, yeah. Rundowns. News, like in a newsroom, a rundown is what's in the first block, what are the stories, and it comes out of the morning meeting or afternoon meeting, assignment editing meeting. And that breaks my heart, Brian, almost more than the yelling. If I record Laura Ingraham or whatever block and Fox, and then I flip over to that after I've watched half an hour on MSNBC or CNN, and the rundown, what they're covering, the first 5 stories, you would think they're in 2 different countries that just happen to speak the same language.
It's true. And I think it's dangerous because what we're forgetting is that we often have more in common than we think we do. That when you actually sit down with a lot of these people, your values are not that different. It's the way you get to the end point where the differences are. If we could agree on a common set of facts, so we could debate policy, we could debate things. It's impossible if you ever gotten someone who's programmed, so to speak, by these things. And what I don't mean to say they're like brainwashed or that there's like a puppet master out there, pulling the marionette strings. What I mean is somebody who's getting this misinformation. Limbaugh has been off for most of the last 2 weeks for his cancer treatment. And he did a call-in last week for 30 minutes on his own show. He starts out joking around saying, Mr. Matthews, to his substitute host, I got around the call screener because of course I built this operation, so I know how to, get around it and circumvent it. But then he starts talking about how, well, why are we trusting these like the doctors, the epidemiological
Epidemiologists,
the epidemiologists in the government, they're just another variant of the deep state. And I'm thinking to myself, here's a guy with lung cancer who's pretty much at very high risk of this virus, and he's spreading what is a conspiracy theory in essence. And so if you get somebody who starts buying into that stuff, it's impossible to dislodge. There's nothing you can do to break it off.
Yeah, I have to say, I have a friend in Illinois. We've been on shows since, 15 years, right? The right and the left. I'm more left to center. He's very conservative and probably certainly smarter than I'll ever be, this guy. And he's great at making an argument. And he was on, like you said, local Chicago conservative radio. He still is, 560 AM. And then he just got picked up by Salem Radio Network, right? The conservative radio network.
Oh, is this Dan?
Dan Croft. And we agree on maybe 5 to 10% of policy, I would say, but we can still go get a drink afterwards and give each other a bunch of shit and have a good time. It's, and make fun of each other. Because he's a whip smart guy, and he will listen. He will listen to another side. He may not agree with you, but he's not shouting down everything that you're saying. And I've gone on his national show now, but it leads to my question, because there's that type of guy. And then there's, sometimes, and by the way, I'm sure people on the right think this when they're watching, Chris Matthews or whatever, but sometimes there's such polemicists, right? There's so much, it sounds like there's so much anger and an effort to absolutely get people so charged up, right or left, that I often wonder when I'm watching, Brian, I wonder if Lorraine really believes all that, the last 45 minutes, what she's saying. Because it's so one-sided, and she seems like a very intelligent person. Is she just doing that because she's owned by the need to drive those eyeballs for ad rates and keep her job because it's a business?
I mean, I what I'd like to say is at their root, all of these conservative hosts, or most of them, are conservatives. Most of them have been conservatives for their whole life. There are people who very suspiciously saw the light and underwent an epiphany right at the point that Rush takes off, who conveniently moved right. And I think a lot of these shows have also moved right over their time on the air. And some of that is, I think, feeding off the audience. Some of that is as they're aging and as the culture's changing, they're reacting in the same ways that their audiences are reacting. Some of it is that they live in their own echo chamber. You can only say things for so long before you actually genuinely believe it. And also that where are they getting their news? If you go back to those early days, Limbaugh has just gone national. He's reading for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. Now he still does that, but there's Red State and there's Breitbart and there's Town Hall and there's Daily Caller. So a lot of these people are living in that world. What they're getting is some of these same stories. And again, it's about where I think the impact is not so much belief, but presentation. Where you go from being a conservative who goes with the John McCain 2008 line where he says about Barack Obama, ma'am, at the town hall, he says to the woman, he says, ma'am, he's a good, decent Christian American. We just have fundamental disagreements. Or, I'm paraphrasing.
Bygone era, it feels like.
Right. These hosts, there's no value in that for them. Nobody wants to hear that. They want to hear that, Nancy Pelosi is Satan's spawn and she's out to destroy American values. That's why they're tuning in to hear somebody say what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And so it encourages the language being more extreme and the presentation. But, do they believe the conservatism that they're espousing? Yeah, they do. Do they believe that liberals are willing to fight harder than conservatives and win more? They do, even though I don't know a Democrat who actually thinks that Democrats are good at politics or that they win very often. That's the sentiment. That's how these people feel. And so I guess what I would say is there's a certain element of act to this. There's a certain element of
Right.
performance.
That's it.
But I don't want to sit here and say, well, these people are just fakers, because if they were getting on and acting every day, their audience would catch on.
Right. They'd sniff it. They'd sniff it out. All right. Last question. I wanted to talk about the book and about this subject, not about coronavirus, but you are not just about media, you are and politics. You are about history too, and very studied. So we're doing this program on March 30th. Okay, where the just for future reference, where the death toll is now above 2,500. So it's cleared the 18 years we've been in the war in Afghanistan, and it probably just cleared the deaths, the death count in 9/11, and expected to get a whole lot worse, and we just don't know how much worse, but by orders of magnitude. So, but you studied history. Where do you think we're going from here, and what role do you think the media is playing and should play in terms of bringing the country together? I mean, if there's a moment in my lifetime when I remember that the country needed to get, not just the military, going and fighting a war, not just the elections, not whatever, where the country had to come together and do something in unison, which it's not doing yet, if you ask me. It's right now. What are your thoughts about where we are?
I mean, the media, I think, can be really dangerous in this moment, especially with where the conservative media has been. Number one, the media should not be encouraging anyone to leave their house or downplaying this or saying, well, the cure could be worse than the disease. Look, there's going to be a lot of economic pain, and we're probably all going to feel it over the next couple of months. And the Congress is going to have to step up. The bill they passed, the $2 trillion stimulus bill, is going to only be a first step. If we're doing this right. That's the practical reality of this, is that this is going to be bad unless there's some sort of breakthrough. And I don't think it's impossible, and I don't think anybody knows whether there will be or won't be, where in a couple of months we get some sort of drug, not a vaccine, but some sort of drug that lessens the impact or makes this less deadly or something. That's not impossible, and I don't have a crystal ball. But absent that, we're going to have to stay home for a couple of months. In many ways, it's kind of jaw-dropping when you think of the technological advances we made over the last century, that we're essentially in the same spot they were in 1918 with the flu pandemic, where they basically said stay home. That's the best tactic we have.
I just wrote, I think you might have come across yesterday, a long article about that, and I went back and looked at studies about 1918, and you're right on the money. And it's 102 years ago, and the same thing. There were cities that locked it down faster and kept the lockdown on longer, and they suffered fewer deaths. This has been studied. By the way, these studies came out in 2007. So 13 years ago, these studies were available. It's mind-blowing and infuriating to see what's going on. But I think that you're right. Look, you never know. The media still could come together, and people still could behave a lot more responsibly. Fear has a way of inspiring certain things. Maybe we have to get past the threshold.
They do, and realistically, the average American is saying, no, we don't want to reopen the economy by Easter, when President Trump was suggesting that. And President Trump seems to have gotten, well, I don't want to say he's gotten a dose of reality, because while mixing kind of more realistic messaging about death tolls and how long people are going to have to be locked down, he was also spinning conspiracy theories about what was happening to masks in New York City, and they were disappearing from hospitals. So I don't want to say he got a dose of reality, but I think that even he is starting to be sobered by where we're headed. And like I said, it's not impossible that there's a breakthrough or something. But absent that, I do think the media is going to have to explain to the average American why they have to stay home, why, as they see the economy crumbling, why, as they're experiencing economic anxiety, that staying home is a must. Explaining to them that we can't overwhelm the healthcare system, or doctors are going to have to make life and death choices. This person lives, this person dies, and that we're going to get our doctors sick and lower our healthcare capacity. So it's a very sobering moment, and a reminder of how, for as far as medical technology has come, that we still have these areas where we're somewhat powerless. And I do think it's a moment that the media has to be responsible. I think it's been a mistake on both MSNBC and Fox's parts, quite honestly, to keep those commentators on at night. I would rather see news anchors with experts, medical experts, because those are the people who can inform the audience as opposed to, you know, playing to the usual tropes and things. And I don't think Sean Hannity interviewing a medical expert is as valuable as someone who is a journalist, someone who has the credibility, whether that person is left-leaning or right-leaning. I'm not talking about ideology here. I'm talking about training. I think we'd be better off seeing more journalism and expertise and less commentary. You know, I haven't written a column in a month, in part for that reason, feeling like, you know, there's nothing I have to say to anybody that is going to be as valuable as what a medical expert might say. And kind of clearing the stage for them. But so it's problematic in that sense, and I think the media needs to step up and realize that. But, you know, at some point here, there's going to be a danger where the media, especially these talk radio and cable news hosts, pick up on the fact that their audience is getting antsy, that their audience is over quarantine. God knows we're already over quarantine. Most people have after 3 weeks. You know, where are we going to be in a month? And where there's going to start to be more and more pressure, and you want them to be responsible and say, no, you know, we can't let the horse out of the barn now. We've waited this long. Now let's give it those last few weeks.
Yeah. No, I think that you're right about all that. I think we sound a little chimeric in hoping that they would do that on the evening. But it's great to see that you still have that idealism, especially knowing everything that you do.
Just that much of it left.
Look, I'm with you. Believe me, I get my screeds going about the media, and I think, oh, you're just talking to yourself. But sometimes you just got to get it out of your system cathartically. Let me say the name of the book one more time before I thank Brian. Talk Radio's America: How an Industry Took Over a Political Party that took over the United States. And you can check out Brian Rosenwald and just Google that and Talk Radio or Washington Post, and you'll see that he's written another book about the media and talk and radio even before this one, about the Republican Party and its relation to it. I love your writing. I love what you're doing, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to me. Thank you, Brian.
Michael, my pleasure.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching, everybody. Talk to you all soon on the Golden Mean.